Evil is afforded no luxury of mistakes, for evil's greatness lies within its precision that leaves no room for error. Inaccuracy will mean a gap in its armor that could lead to its downfall. Unlike its opposite, good, evil must be without flaw, perfect, or depend upon the imperfections of its targets. Villains have long served as the dark side of humanity's ideals. In myth and folklore, they serve to personify the forces of chaos, evil, or immorality. Characters like Ishtar from the ancient epic of Gilgamesh, Kali the Hindu god of death, and Kronos in Greek mythology each embody different facets of fear and consequence. But perhaps the most iconic villain of all, Satan, emerges in Western tradition standing as both tempter and ultimate adversary. In Marvel, this iconic villain archetype is recast in the form of Mephisto, who is a demon modeled on Satan's theme of temptation. In one particular storyline, Fear itself, Ghost Rider, humanity's intrinsic flaws are explored to the mythic first man, Adam, and the Satan-like Mephisto, respectively. Adam wants to purify the world to make it a godlier place by eradicating all sin, but all this achieves is the reduction of a person into a mindless husk of themselves, a zombie. Mephisto highlights that sin is a vital part of human identity, telling Johnny Blaze that the drive to overcome temptation is what makes humanity both flawed and meaningful. Stan Lee's original concept of Mephisto was to have someone represent a universal symbol of evil without overtly religious overtones. Therefore, Mephisto embodies Satan's goal to pervert and destroy all that is good and pure in humanity, illustrating the timeless battle between virtue and vice. The characterization of Satan here differs from classic depictions of evil. Nathan Allen Breen's analysis of demonic figures in Old English poetry sheds light on how antagonistic characters like Mephisto are intentionally depicted as inferior, as in lacking the protagonist's knowledge, agency, or virtue. This approach emphasizes the strategic othering of their characters to uphold the hero's moral high ground, in turn making the heroes more likable, which leads to two specific effects. 1. By making the villains appear fundamentally different, a psychological separation is created that prevents the audience from empathizing with the villain. This lack of empathy means that we feel little to no discomfort when they're harmed or defeated. And 2. This othering shifts the context of violence within a narrative, meaning the hero's actions are insulated from more scrutiny, so when they perform actions usually deemed evil, like breaking the law or inflicting harm, they are instead redefined as righteous, or even heroic acts because they are directed at a morally reprehensible character. An old Japanese folklore, Shoten Doji, shows how the concept of othering allows us to justify characters' actions that, in other contexts, would seem repulsive to us. In this story, an evil demon welcomes a band of heroes who have come to kill him as honored guests. Despite his infamous reputation, he acts as a generous and trusting host. However, these very qualities are what lead to his downfall. The heroes exploit the demon's trust, using deception to kill him in his sleep. Even though the hero's actions, deception, betrayal, and murder would usually be condemned, they are celebrated because the demon has been successfully othered as a villain. Their deceitful tactics are reframed as clever rather than dishonest. As you can see, this process allows us to separate the villain from any empathetic or human qualities, to make him a figure who exists solely for more opposition. The villain is seen through the eyes of the protagonist, meaning their evil nature is a relative concept, emerging not just as an opposing character to the protagonist's values and goals, but as an embodiment of disruption, an agent of chaos that revels in their evil acts, marked by a reputation steeped in darkness. They can be characterized as distinct archetypes of malevolence, from crooks to tyrants and everything in between. The villain is cast as an individual working outside the boundaries of law or morality, a disruptor of order and an antagonist to both the protagonist and the concept of righteousness. Each type serves a narrative purpose, which is to incite conflict and tension. Without them, there will be no sense of urgency. Without the maiden's kidnapping, there will be no need for the hero's journey to rescue her, and no story to be told at all. The term evil invokes a spectrum of responses in the mind's eye. For some, it calls to mind images of supervillains who use their powers to subjugate the innocent with flamboyant schemes. These villains usually embody hated vices, represented as larger-than-life forces of malice who revel in their evil actions. But the word evil is more than just a convenient label for these fantastical figures. Most of us invoke it when we're faced with the most brutal acts of terror, or the calculated cruelty of serial killers like Ted Bundy. In these cases, the term evil conveys a level of moral indignation that no other term can effectively convey. But what exactly makes someone evil? How does labeling someone or something as evil sets it apart from its less severe cousin, bad? What is evil in the first place? In this video, I will provide multiple responses to these questions. The concept of evil, like that of heroism, first begins as a passion-filled response to the uncomfortable pressure of some type of critical questioning that forces one to clarify and justify their beliefs. The two main groups in these debates are those who argue that evil is a dangerous myth, clouding our understanding of moral dilemmas. They are called evil skeptics. And on the opposing side are those who believe that evil is integral to our moral discourses that grounds our understanding of extreme wrongdoings. Regardless of their stances, both sides must give their respective accounts of evil for the debate to be productive. This requirement is common in all types of critical questionings. For instance, in debates about the existence of gods, religious and atheist people must clarify what they mean by God first. This is done in order to avoid any possible misunderstandings in the future and to prevent both sides talking at each other. The word evil was originally a synonym of bad, and its usage still persists in some contexts today, but more often is used as a moral judgment applied to actions and persons that deeply violate ethical norms. In everyday uses of evil, we find two main applications. People often describe a wrongful action as an evil one, and a bad person as an evil one. These labels emerge in response to morally wrong actions. For example, people call Hitler's actions against Jews evil rather than simply wrong, and in turn refer to him as an evil person. While attempting to analyze what it means to deem something evil, we must consider the relationship between evil actions and evil persons. The most obvious and simplest description of evil will be a unified account that encompasses both actions and people, identifying evil as a grave moral repulsiveness. But this unity can only go so far. An action can be ethically deplorable for different reasons than a person might be, meaning these judgments, while related, function separately. Part of what it means to label an action as evil is to say that it's something morally unforgivable. Saying an action ought not to be performed makes sense, but the same does not apply to people. It's nonsensical to say a person ought not to be performed or exist. Judging by the direction recent philosophical discussions have moved, it seems that more and more people are beginning to realize this, and begin thinking of more distinct frameworks for understanding evil actions and persons. According to philosophers like Hebron and Singer, an effective way to approach the concept of evil is to first identify the character traits of an evil person, and then define evil actions as any that exhibit those traits. They suggest that an evil person is someone who has profoundly deadened moral sensibilities, such as someone who exhibits extreme selfishness or cruelty in every aspect of their character. However, there's a potential problem with their approach to understanding evil. In many cases of character traits, like generosity or deceitfulness, it's difficult to differentiate between the good and the bad ones without first having a clear idea of the actions that convey them. For example, when we think of what it means to be a generous person, we usually think of specific actions, like giving to others selflessly, that define what it means to have a generous character. The same problem applies to evil as well. If we can define what it means to be an evil person without citing evil actions, then this approach is not as reliable as it might seem at first. Simply asserting that an evil person is persistently inclined to engage in certain acts that highlight their alignment with malevolent intentions, such as lying, theft, or violence, is not nearly enough. It is not enough for us to define evil by solely focusing on actions like murder to explain what it means to be evil. For even an overall virtuous person might occasionally commit an evil act, such as lying, yet this doesn't make them an evil person. And of course, not all actions of an evil person are evil, such as eating, drinking, breathing, or using the latrine.
What? You gonna wash your hands?
No, 'cause I'm evil.
So instead of defining an evil person first, it may be better to define what constitutes an evil action first, and then we can use those behaviors as a basis to assign the label of evil person. In this way, an evil person is someone who frequently or habitually performs morally corrupt actions, or who is highly inclined toward performing them under specific conditions. As an example, take the character of Azula from Avatar, more specifically Book 2 of Avatar. In it, she embodies an evil person as we've outlined. Her actions are persistently marked by cruelty, manipulation, and a clear intention to cause harm and to dominate others. Her behavior is deeply aligned with malevolent aims. But by the time the story reaches the graphic novel Uzula in the Spirit Temple, the label doesn't quite apply to her any longer. Even though her actions are still morally wrong, they don't necessarily stem from any intrinsic evilness, but instead reflect her inner conflict. Here, Azula's motives do not convey the same unrelenting malevolence they did in her introduction, and so her character has arguably moved from being that of an evil person. We must beware of thinking of good and evil as absolute opposites. They are halves of a paradoxical whole. The previous segment has shown the importance of defining evil actions and the usefulness of such definitions for a broader understanding of evil itself. Now we return to specific examples of evil actions that are presented to us by recent narratives. Within these stories we can explore an important question. Are all evil actions, by definition, morally wrong actions? Some believe that evil actions are inherently against our moral standards, and therefore cannot be justifiable, while others believe that evil and moral rightness are not mutually exclusive, meaning some actions can be both evil and morally right under specific contexts. According to this view, evil can be justified if certain conditions are met. In scenarios like the trolley problem, the only option we have is to choose the lesser of two evil actions. Here, the issue is not about using the label evil to express our full disapproval of an act like murder. Instead, it's about the idea that evil and morally wrong are necessarily interchangeable terms. Superhero comics resemble the Judeo-Christian notion of apocalyptic redemption, the belief that good can only occur after a dramatic confrontation with evil, in which destruction is the path to ultimate salvation. This feeds into the revenge fantasy that makes the superhero genre so appealing. It doesn't take a genius to recognize that the prevailing model of justice presented in these stories is vigilantism, where the heroes take justice into their own hands. This retributive, vigilante justice aligns with America's cultural values that advocates for direct action against evil, that disregards legal processes in favor of one's own moral codes. As we have seen before, this form of justice mirrors the very tactics of the villains. The heroes ought to perform evil actions to defeat evil. On the side of Frank Castle are those who believe an action is evil but necessary when it's the only way to achieve an altruistic goal. Nevertheless, this shouldn't be used as a justification for the actions that people like Frank perform. In some cases, people use evil simply as a synonym for bad. As an example, in phrases like the lesser of two evils, the term evil means harmful and not morally wrong. Frank's idea then that one has to do evil to prevent more or greater evil does not evoke the concept of evil at all, but rather something that is unfortunate or regrettable. As I said, evil started out as a synonym for bad, and some still use the label with its original meaning in mind, meaning when they describe an action as evil, they simply mean that it has negative consequences, such as a criminal's family is left heartbroken by their death. But in Frank's mind, the consequence does not in itself make the action morally wrong. Then, on the side of Matt Murdock are those, like your favorite hypocritical superheroes, who view an evil action as one that cannot be excused morally under any circumstance, and as a result, every evil act is inherently morally wrong. Frank attempts to justify his perspective by proposing a totally hypothetical scenario in which person A murders person B to prevent B from murdering person C, D, and E. He concedes that the murder of B is devastating for B, but he believes the act to be justified by consequentialist reasoning. He prevented the murder of C, D, and E, and this achieved a greater good than simply arresting B. However, Matt asserts that if A's motivation comes from malice and takes pleasure in harming B, devoid of any concern for the greater good, that means the action will nevertheless be evil, despite its beneficial outcome. For people like Matt, the conditions of an action being considered evil depends on motive as well as outcome. In this way of looking at evil, A's action, if driven by malice, is both evil and wrong. This argument is quite troublesome for consequentialists like Frank, as it highlights an unsettling duality. Frank knows something is morally wrong about A's murder of B if motivated by malice, even if it results in a net good. Yet he still maintains that A's murder of B is both evil and morally right, or at least justifiable, and refuses to engage with Matt's argument. But a third point of view arises when we look at a person's actions with an even more critical eye. We find that objective consequentialist, as opposed to subjective, which is the side of Frank, can be used to argue that certain motives can be intrinsically bad independent of outcomes. By this logic, one could argue that while A's murder of B to save C, D, and E is morally right, A's deriving sadistic pleasure from B's suffering is inherently bad. Therefore, A's pleasure in B's suffering is an act of moral wrong, even though the killing itself is neither inherently wrong nor evil. Frank's side challenges what many of us take as basic assumptions about evil actions, that they ought not to be performed, that people ought to be stopped from performing them, and that those who perform them ought to be punished. Essentially, from both consequentialist perspectives, the morality of killing B depends on the resulting good, and should A change their mind, they would encourage another person to step in and perform the act instead, as the end goal, saving C, D, and E, remains ethically right in their mind. This of course runs counter to a widely held belief that evil actions are, by their very nature, moral wrongs. But let's not ignore the perspective of the religious, who believe that those who commit evil acts are possessed. If a person's actions result from an external force overpowering their will, then, according to this view, they are not in control of their actions, so we ought to feel compassion for them rather than condemn them, as they are but helpless victims than morally culpable agents. This is the question explored in the horror classic The Exorcist. The ambiguous answer it provides with its main character showcases the difficulty in understanding whether the evil acts are motivated by the child's own ambitions, or by an external force that has taken over her. In the former case, her actions represent a part of her identity that is intrinsic to her, so she should be met with fear. But in the latter case, she is merely a victim and we should feel sympathetic towards her. This reflects the age-old philosophical debate between freedom and determinism. Are a thief and a kleptomaniac one and the same? Should we judge them the same? Is the demon within the child simply represents her truest self, or is she a mere puppet of some invasive force? Or maybe the demon is a form of self-alienation, a part of her identity that is both intrinsic and alien to her. This is where the concept of the enemy within comes in, a force that's both part of and apart from one's core self, which means that evil has roots within us all, but remains separate enough to feel like an intrusion when we act on it. Aristotle believed that a tragedy should invoke in us both pity and fear at the same time, because it involves characters who are caught between their personal agency and forces that are beyond their control. This is what the concept of someone being possessed by evil refers to, as it compels us to feel both sympathy for the villain's suffering and horror at their actions. There exists no clear-cut distinction that separates influence from freedom. Much of what influences us is first interpreted, i.e. understood and given meaning, in order to impact our behavior. We can have some degree of freedom because we can reinterpret our past and change how it affects us. Essentially, the things that influence us come from how we frame our experiences, and our interpretations can change or evolve with time, which is what gives us freedom. There is a concept called true autonomy, meaning complete independence from social influences. This in reality is as much a form of non-being as complete submission to our influences. Such a person will be more akin to a robot or a zombie than anything related to a human. Monster in ancient thought referred to a creature wholly independent of others. Our social interactions are what allows us to develop our sense of self and autonomy in the first place. Things like freedom and responsibility only have meaning because we are part of a culture that has given meaning to these ideas. None of our actions can be separated from this social conditioning. Even evil actions such as torture or deception rely on the social skills we have developed and understood. When we are alone, it's the same as a dog or a sofa being alone. Our isolation, or rather our concept of it, is informed by society. We are capable of reaching some level of self-determination, but this autonomy will always be set within our dependency on others, which is fundamental to our humanity. This is what allows us to develop our sense of self and freedom. For that reason, true freedom involves an active engagement with social influences, making us more than just puppets of our environment. By contrast, the goal of evil is to achieve a state of true autonomy, a self-sufficiency that claims absolute independence from others and a total control of oneself. In Shakespearean dramas, it is those who proclaim they answer only to themselves that are the villains. Many would agree that evil actions differ from other forms of moral wrongdoing, particularly those that are trivial or minor moral failings. Evil in this view is a significant form of moral wrongdoing that stands apart from injustice. In support of this, philosopher Claudia Todd argues that evil is a heavy judgment. Much that is bad is disappointing, undesirable, inferior, even unjust or unfair, but not evil. Many wrongdoings are trivial. Evils never are, even if their perpetrators are ordinary people, and their motives are not unusual. The Dark Knight and the Joker stand in opposition to this notion. They portray evil as sometimes including minor evils, acts that are only slightly immoral, yet the label evil still applies to them. This view offers us an interpretation of evil as being a spectrum that includes both extreme and marginal wrongs. But that alone is not enough. There exist multiple ways to ascertain just how extreme an act is, and it's not clear which conditions should be met in order to correctly distinguish an evil act from a good one. To phrase it in the form of a question, if evil is meant to be very wrong, what exactly makes it so? Evil actions could be defined by the level of harm they cause, in which case only those that cause great harm can qualify as evil, such as the Joker murdering Rachel and disfiguring Harvey Dent, or Arthur gunning down 3 people. Or evil actions could be acts that invoke an intense feeling in victims and witnesses alike, such as the Joker's ferry conundrum, or Arthur admitting his crimes to Murray on live television. Although one could make strong cases for both of these perspectives, there still persists the issue of those acts that fail to cause great harm, yet they are still considered evil. Instead of claiming that evil actions ought to be defined by their relationship to the extremity of their consequences or their emotional reactions, we could argue that they are extreme in a more nuanced way. An example would be an unsuccessful attempt to cause great harm, such as the Riddler's failed attempt to frame James Gordon for murder in the TV show Gotham. The point here being that Riddler's intention, motivation, and moral depravity can make his actions evil regardless of the outcome. I fail to see why luck should make his attempt any less deserving of condemnation than if he were to succeed with the same intent. Therefore, evil exists in intention and attempt, and not only in the consequences. Another example of what might be called harmless evil is Batman's choice to monitor people without their consent in hopes of finding criminals like the Joker. Here, Batman does not cause any suffering or pain directly. However, Lucius maintains that such actions do inflict harm by violating people's privacy. Batman's disregard for personal boundaries, according to Lucius, is both wrong and harmful, as in it denies individuals the respect they are owed. Thus, certain actions, even if they don't cause immediate or obvious harm, such as spying or failed attempts at a harmful act, can also constitute as evil. Many who join the discourse of evil view evil actions as an intensified subcategory of morally wrong actions. To them, this means that once we identify the appropriate types of wrongness, culpability, and extremity, we have arrived at a correct definition of evil actions. This definition would mean that while all the evil actions are morally wrong, not all morally wrong actions are evil. This implies that it's not enough for an action to be extremely wrong and culpable. It must also stem from specific intentions or motives. Examples include malice, cruelty, or a desire to cause harm. In the Batman the Animated Series Heart of Ice, Batman encounters Mr. Freeze for the first time. This encounter provides us with an opportunity to re-examine our view of evil. Initially, we assumed Victor to be an insane monster who was motivated by extreme malice and an antisocial personality disorder. But as the story progressed, we discovered that Victor was chillingly normal. His actions are motivated not by extreme malice or a desire to cause harm, but by an unwavering love for his wife, and wasn't thinking clearly about his actions. Unlike the other villains Batman had encountered so far, Victor was not perverse or sadistic, nor did he seek to do wrong for its own sake. But even despite his relatable motives, we maintain that Victor did evil. This leads one to the conclusion that evil does not always come from extreme malice. It can also be the result of individuals becoming consumed by their own motives, so much so that they don't realize the harm they cause. Victor's actions reveal the banality of evil. Mr. Freeze's character shows that evil actions do not stem from a single motive or mindset. Instead, they can come from all sorts of motivations and can be carried out by a diverse set of agents. For some, malice or personal hatred toward their victims fuel their wrongdoings. For others, it can be the result of being forced to follow orders, or simply an intense emotional reaction. Some enjoy the consequences of their actions, whereas others perform them out of an unyielding sense of duty and feel deep regret over their actions. In some cases, they are aware of the harm they cause, while in others, they are convinced of their own misguided righteousness. What qualifies all of these actions as evil, regardless of the wide range of motives, is that they all exhibit a deliberate choice to break moral boundaries. This leads to a different perspective, one that moves our attention from the consequence of an evil action to the internal reasoning behind why it was performed. According to this perspective, to label an act as evil is not simply to highlight its moral defect, but to make an assertion about the psychological state of the agent performing the act. Just as we withhold the label compassionate from acts not rooted in a genuine desire to ease another's suffering for their own sake, similarly, the idea here is that an action is evil not merely due to it causing great harm, but because it comes from a particularly malevolent intention and is accompanied by distinct psychological traits. This perspective distinguishes evil acts from simple wrongdoings by requiring both the severity of the harm and the presence of a motive born out of malice toward the victim. A wrongful act performed with malice in mind appears, intuitively so, to be more morally wrong than the same act performed without it, as malice intensifies the moral depravity of wrongdoing. Therefore, by this approach, acts committed with clear malice, such as those of serial killers or partners who murder their spouses, are strong examples of what we might confidently label evil actions, because they involve deliberate, unnecessary harm driven by malevolent motivation. But if this perspective holds, then that means that even if an act is extremely wrong, like torturing to obtain information, it cannot be labeled as evil if the agent performing it lacks the psychological traits of malice. This raises the question, if malice is to be a fundamental condition for evil, does that align with our common moral intuitions? If it doesn't, we need to consider whether we should adjust our intuitions about what constitutes as an evil act. An alternative suggestion is that the true psychological trait of evil is not malice per se, but the sadistic pleasure the agent derives from the suffering of their victims. This notion fits cultural archetypes of villains in literature and film, such as Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost and the Joker in the Batman mythos. They not only perform acts of harm, but also relish in them. It is true that many evil acts, torture, revenge, or rape, are performed with pleasure, and because this kind of psychological state is so viscerally disgusting to us, it can seem like the natural mark of distinguishing evil acts from mere severe moral wrongs. But believing so would exclude many serious wrongdoings, such as ideologically driven acts carried out with a perverted sense of duty, from fitting the label evil, even though they are nevertheless morally disturbing. Many people would disagree with the claim that, since Mr. Freeze did not find his murderous actions sadistically pleasurable, he did not perform evil. Another alternative psychological mark of evil is the idea that what makes an action truly evil may not be how morally wrong it is, but whether the agent performing it knows it is wrong and chooses to do it anyway. While all evil actions are morally wrong, not all moral violations arise from conscious defiance of moral law. Some agents perform horrible acts believing they are doing the right thing. These acts are still wrong, but not necessarily evil. Others still perform those same acts with full awareness of their moral transgressions. It is in the latter condition, deliberate, informed moral defiance, that could serve as the mark of evil, in which case what sets evil apart is not merely the extremity of the wrongdoing, but the fact that the agent knowingly chooses to violate what we recognize as the moral order. Yet not all instances of defiant wrongdoing are performed by a choice to do wrong for wrongness' sake. Many who violate moral law perform wrongdoings with the intention of achieving a desired end. A person might perform an act they fully recognize as deeply immoral to eliminate those who do the same but out of a less well-intentioned motive, like Frank Castle, Yagami Light, or your favorite superheroes. Like malice or pleasure, defiance seems to intensify the moral depravity of an action, and it's no surprise that some have argued that it is a fundamental condition for evil. But this perspective is also not without flaw. It carries the implication that even if an agent truly believes, albeit mistakenly, that their harmful wrongdoing is morally acceptable, they cannot be said to have performed an evil action, even if the act itself is atrocious. For example, since Adolf Hitler justified his actions against the Jews as beneficial for the good of Germany, then by this framework he did not perform evil. We like to see ourselves as the heroes of our own stories. We work hard to maintain a positive self-image, yet in one specific context we are willing to explore our darker selves, the world of villains. Fictional villains provide a unique way for us to explore our own darker tendencies within the safe confines of fiction. This exploration is more acceptable in a fictional setting because it avoids real-world consequences. It provides a safe haven. This is why villains tend to be more interesting than the heroes. In truth, we only care about a handful of people in our lives, so it is highly unlikely that we'll be interested in the complex personal struggles of a stranger, unless it somehow resonated with us. Because similarity is inherently attractive. It creates a common ground for understanding, and villains give us an excuse to explore the more sinister aspects of our psyche that dwells within us all and which we constantly resist. This allows us to better understand ourselves, which is why similarity to a fictional villain can be intriguing and less harmful to one's self-image than comparison to a real-life one. From cape crime fighters like Superman to megalomaniac masterminds like Lex Luthor, we have always used storytelling to celebrate good and condemn evil. They always came packaged with more lessons to teach us effective survival strategies. Because evil and good are rather adaptable concepts. What was good 1,000 years ago is evil today. What's evil today might be considered good in the future. The evolution of our species as social beings fueled by intelligence, collective thinking, and mutual support necessitated the invention of abstract principles that could justify our continued existence. The distinction between good and evil, or heroes and villains, is fundamental, as it reflects the moral judgments of society. Western films make it easy to tell the difference by having the villain wear black and the hero white. But others have proposed a more elemental way to differentiate them. According to them, heroes embody the virtues and ideas that society aspires to. They serve as role models, while villains, being the antithesis of heroes, serve as cautionary figures for the audience. They, more often than not, have traits associated with Machiavellianism, such as lack of morality, charisma, and manipulation. Characters with these elements are intuitively perceived as Machiavellian. As we're experiencing the story to the protagonist, a villain is defined from their POV. So, like the protagonist, a villain is someone that we must know. Examples include Green Goblin, Reverse Flash, Thanos, Darth Vader, and Hades. Truly anybody in any form of media can become the villain. In melodramas, it's made clear to us who the villain is because they usually announce their evil motivations before attempting to act on them. The motivations of villains range from grandiose goals like taking over the world to personal vendettas, but their actions usually create conflict for the protagonist. Characters like Lex Luthor and Manchester Black shows us how villains can be charismatic, manipulative, and driven by complex desires. Let's say you have a protagonist on a journey of inner growth and change. Then the villain's job is to hold up a mirror to your hero's darker tendencies that they carry within themselves. If you want a truly unforgettable villain, then Aristotle suggests to make the connection to the hero personal, and the deeper that connection goes, the better. Daredevil demonstrates this relationship. Matt Murdock is a public defense attorney fighting for the good of the people. However, Wilson Fisk manipulates facts and the judicial system for purely personal gain. Thus, Fisk becomes the villain in Matt's story. If the protagonist is working to resolve the major dramatic conflict, then the villain has to be actively working to contribute to the protagonist's conflict. They must truly enjoy their work. They must derive a sense of pleasure, satisfaction, or accomplishment from their malevolent actions. A vigilante who is a morally good character is never the villain, but a vigilante that butchers and murders criminals can be considered one. And they cannot commit murders without attracting victims. And no true villain can attract victims unless they possess charm, charisma, position, or wealth. For someone to be notorious, they must have stacked up an impressive kill count. They must be morally bad, not just badly behaved. They must be malicious, not just mischievous. And they, much like any other character, have to have a want, an objective. It can be fame, fortune, or the destruction of something great or good itself. Under the eyes of the law, every criminal has a motive. Therefore, every villain must have an objective they strive for. Aristotle theorized that a truly villainous character could not be the protagonist because they invoke neither pity nor fear from the audience. Now, that might have been true during his time where the concept of heroes and villains were rather simplistic, but in the modern age, filled with morally great characters, I do not believe that to be true anymore. I would argue that what he said can be applied to antagonists, but for villains it's just simply not the case. For example, as we follow Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, it's very easy to feel pity for this beaten, traumatized, lonely veteran working as a cab driver, and as he slowly plans a political assassination, he invokes a sense of fear in us from his growing mental instability. There are dozens of other examples like this where the villain is a main character that I believe prove Aristotle wrong. The last perspective on evil argues that it, and by extension villains, functions almost like an adaptive feature of a collective psyche, a kind of psychic immune response to perceived betrayals of a moral law. In this perspective, to label an act evil serves to merely highlight a dip in the expected balance of care within our in-groups, the respective communities each of us claim ourselves to. More on this in a future video soon. In other words, evil itself is a fiction, a convenient label we apply whenever opinions, interests, worldviews, or anything of the sorts collide. And so, many characteristics of villains, such as foreign accents, or disgusting appearances, are less evidence of evil than cues for a tendency to utter those who threaten our moral equilibrium. Once an act is labeled as evil, inquiry into its motivations become banal, and thus the stage is set for draconian justice. Such is the case in Shoten Doji. However, maybe the renewed interest in Satan in contemporary fiction is indicative that many are waking up to the reality that evil is simply always just an issue of perspective. An archetype we use, not because evil is real, but because it is useful. Good day, sir. Or lady.